Hey, and welcome to the podcast. We are excited to sit back down today and continue the conversations that we've been having. And so last week we talked about the culture of consistency and how consistency is not only a vital thing in order for you to keep a job, but consistency is also something that is vital for your parents, vital for your students, and vital for your students' development of their faith on top of that. And so with that, we began this conversation, and we're going to kind of bridge this out over the next 3 weeks, and we're going to talk about 3 different scenarios in where consistency as a ministry overall is important. And we are going to spend this week talking about how to continue that culture of consistency as a youth pastor leaving a church. Next week, we're going to talk about keeping that consistency within your ministry by training your volunteers so they can run it during in the interim. And then maybe you're, for the 3rd week, if you're the new youth pastor stepping in, how do you adopt the consistency that's already there instead of automatically trying to change everything to fit your ministry looks or what you feel like your last church did really, really well. And so I think all 3 of those conversations are super important. But today we are going to begin that conversation and begin the 3 weeks with the topic of when you are leaving, how do you build and maintain that culture of consistency so you can leave well and you can allow that ministry to continue to thrive even after you step out. So Melissa, take it away.
Okay, so all 3 of us have worked in multiple churches, so we've all done this. I'm not sure that personally I did this as well as what we're going to be talking about, so maybe I will learn something today. So the big question is, what are some of the signs that it might be time for a youth pastor to transition out of a church? So, gentlemen, when did you feel like it was time to move on?
I feel like this is David's question.
Man, I feel called out.
You just did it the most recently, so I think this one is the freshest on your mind.
Yeah, so there was a lot of things, a lot of little things, a lot of big things. But one of the, I'd say the biggest thing for me was I started to have moments where I began to question my effectiveness, and I think that's should be something that we measure all the time, not just when things are kind of tough. But I began to ask myself, the typical age-old youth pastor question: when is time? Am I too old? Different things like that. I'm not terribly old by any means, but there is a point in youth ministry where you start to notice the difference more and more over time. I'm not necessarily young anymore. So that was kind of some of the smaller things, but the bigger thing for me was after, and I don't want to say that I did this totally correctly by any means, but there was a moment of clarity leaving a leadership meeting where I felt like something was off, and there was a lot of different reasons, and I don't want to go into a situation where it comes off as bashing, but I knew it was time for a change. We'll just say that. And so I had a conversation with a friend who I trust, a really, really important accountability partner, sometimes mentor in my life, and we began to just talk through the situation, and he left me with 3 things to think about and to pray about for a week. I spent the next week thinking and praying very intentionally with my wife, and he called me a week later, and he already knew, and so did I. And so the 2 biggest things I would say is having the sense of knowing, or at least trying to, again, say this very kindly, but I guess having the sense that maybe it's time, and then number 2, having someone that you can trust to help you discern.
Yeah, I would echo that, but I would also say it from a different dynamic. So David definitely left his last church in a time of like, I think it's time for us to move on. I think it's time for us to move forward. I left from my last church from a completely different perspective. But I don't think it was necessarily a healthy spot for me either. And it was one of those things that, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the little meme that has like the dog sitting at the like office desk holding a cup of coffee and the office is burning around him, and he's like, this is fine, everything is fine. That's kind of how mine was, because at least in my time for the duration of it, I felt like what I was doing was being effective, but everything else around me was hurting. And so like it was necessarily like the church was struggling, our relationships in that area were struggling, and like we moved across Texas to come back to where I work now. But it was one of those things to where like the ministry was going great. Everything else was going like, well, I mean, let's kind of, we need to sit down and assess this. And finally, really the thing that kind of kicked me into gear on my transition process was my wife sat down and she was like, hey, I've followed you for 7 years. It's your turn to follow me. I need to start a career. And I was like, yes, ma'am. And so I did. And so I left a youth ministry that was thriving. I mean, I had grown this program from like 5 kids to 55 kids weekly. I had 10 parents come as volunteers weekly to teach small groups, like anything and everything you could dream of as far as like efficiency and effectiveness and like people coming to know Jesus and all that stuff. It was going great. But it was one of those things that like I'm a firm believer that my family is my ultimate ministry. And so my ministry is an outpouring of my ministry to my family. And so my wife was like, hey, it's great, but like it's time to move home. And so I had to walk away from a good thing, or at least what I thought was a good thing. And I really didn't realize how bad of a thing it was until I left. Because I had kind of just put up guards and put up blinders around things. And so I think this brings 2 very different dynamics to our preparations for leaving and how we might proceed towards the rest of this conversation.
I love that because mine's kind of in the middle. And so since y'all have great perspectives, we'll leave mine out of it. Especially because mine was in the same town we're currently in. Like I just moved like across town. They've moved cities. So that brings me back to my next question. How did you begin that conversation of, hey, I think it's time for me to go, with your senior pastor that you were leaving?
I'll start this one because David did the last one. I did that terribly. And to this day, that is probably the biggest thing that I regret out of like being at that church. I literally, which granted, I was younger, I was stupid. It was almost 10 years ago. I literally waited and waited and waited, and I was like, oh man, I got to give him time. I got to give him time. I got to give him time. It was on my mind on a Sunday morning, and so I told him right before church. And he kind of just took it sticker shocked. And was just like, okay, well, we can talk about this later. And then he proceeded to go do church, and I didn't even think anything of it. Later, it dawned on me what I had done, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I've apologized to him like 12 times. Just because it was one of those things that was like, I was so focused on my moment of like, I need to tell him that I forgot everything else around me, including the fact that we were at church and service was literally about to start like 10 or 15 minutes later. So.
Well, man, well, on the opposite, as we continue to talk about opposites, after that conversation I had, the moment I had clarity that it was time, I called my pastor and we got coffee. Okay, I drank coffee. He doesn't drink coffee, but anyway, I went with him that day, and this was in yeah, it was right after Christmas, so it was like 28th, 29th of December, and then I left that summer. So he had a semester essentially to think about what he wanted, and so I felt like I needed to give him ample time, and I thought that was the fair thing to do. So obviously, I think Brent ultimately wanted to do the exact same thing, but sometimes something that big is hard to hold on to. It's easy for us to be like, "Oh, Brent, what?" But a situation like that, it weighs on you heavily. I could tell you that conversation I was terrified to have. I was nervous and I couldn't wait. So in a very similar way, I couldn't wait. Um, but it was a fortunate situation that it was not on a Sunday morning, I guess. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
to your credit, and giving yourself a little bit of grace too, that is a very heavy thing to hold on to. So
Okay, so comparing to my experience, let me ask you, this is not on the list question. Did you already have your next job lined up before you told your pastor?
No.
also
And I
no.
think that is a large reasoning on why I did not tell
Mm-hmm.
well, is because it was like, oh yeah, we're moving in like 3 weeks. I have to tell you. And I think I was waiting for like the pretty package of like, hey, here, take all of these things that I like. Here's the plan for my life. Hope you find the next guy, kind of thing like that.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I don't. It didn't come out that way. As a matter of fact, we moved to Abilene, talking about faith and obedience and stuff like that. After we got confirmation that it was the right move and everything, my wife got a job, and I was a stay-at-home dad for almost 5 months. And so it was a very different dynamic. I struggled with it mightily, because it was like, man, I left the job that I had and had nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like, all right, let's see you put your money where your mouth is, and if you genuinely believe what you say, like let's see if that actually holds true.
That's good.
Yeah, experience here, because this, I have moved multiple churches, not a ton in the span of ministry, but at the same time, I've been at enough where I know that one of the first interview questions a search committee or a pastor is going to ask you is, does your pastor know, your current pastor know?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's part of why I had the conversation with my former pastor right away. He was the first person I told. Um, you know, so I think that was really really important, and I needed to know that I had his blessing. We're fairly close friends, I would say. Um, even a year later, we still talk and all of that, which is awesome. But I think because of the way that I handled that with him, that whole dynamic could have been a whole lot different. Had I taken a job and just said, "Deuces, I'm out in 2 weeks." I feel like in ministry, a 2 week notice isn't enough time. I know that sometimes things happen very quickly and you take a job and they want you right away. But I would say more so than not, a church is understanding that they want you to leave your church well. And so they're going to give you the time that you need to say your goodbyes and to try to set affairs in order and stuff like that. But because I was able to have that conversation, I had not only my pastor's blessing, but he was also helping me through the process of discerning what the next church was for me. I had several churches I was looking at, and it ultimately came down to, where is God calling me, and to have the support of my former pastor all the way through the process. I think boded well for coming here. And so I think that's an important detail, if you're looking to go to the next church. In the interview process, I almost guarantee you they will ask you, does your current pastor know that you are talking to us? And if it's a no, that can hurt you. I'm not going to say it will hurt you, but I think it can.
Yeah, because they asked me that on mine, and mine did not know, and I still got the job. Here I am, but I specifically then had to tell them why he did not know, and so that was a hinky. But we are very much a two income household. My husband's a teacher too, and so kids are expensive. So I needed to have the next thing lined up before I could quit this one. So I think my last day for the last church was like December 28th, and my first day for the new church was like January 4th, like right there. So um, I love, but I really do like what David was talking about, where your pastor knows beforehand, is in not necessarily encouraging you, but supporting you through that process. Because we would like to think that pastors, being the people that they are, that are shepherding their church, that they would know that people do not stay in positions their entire lifespan. Like, that's just not realistic. So at some point you are going to move on to something different or something new, or a different location. And so it makes sense to me that a pastor would be supportive. Now, do we see that all the time? No. And that's just because humans are humans. So what do you think? So what are some of the common mistakes that youth pastors make when transitioning out, and how can they avoid those? So we talked about a couple of them. Any
I mean,
other?
I think as far as transitioning, I mean, I think there's a lot of cards at play. And I think this is where the culture of consistency conversation comes in, because I think, and we talked about this last week, one of the things that you have to have kind of ironed out in your ministry for this to be effective is you're not the main guy, or you're not the main girl. If you are the sole person that everybody looks to on organizing and running and equipping things, then when you step out, it's going to crumble, because they're going to be like, well, what they're we don't know what to do because nobody ever told us. We just were given the things to do. And so having that kind of mindset to carry is super, super important. And I think one of the big things with transitions that really, really hurts churches is when the youth pastor does everything, especially if they do more than their job. A lot of youth pastors do a lot more than just youth ministry. They help on the sound team, or they also lead worship, or they run their website, or they do social media, or
Or they
they
clean the
do
kitchen.
all other, yeah, or they
Or
do they
all of
do
the
a
above.
ton of other ministry aspects. And so with that, it's even more damaging in those mindsets, because if you're the guy or a girl that does everything, and you step out and you never trained anybody to do anything, then you just left that church in a world of hurt. And not only world of hurt, they're probably going to regress back to what they knew instead of try to learn what you did, just because out of nature. And so they're going to go back to the things that they know. They're going to go back to the things that they used to do, because that's what they feel comfortable with. And so, especially if you've been in a church for a long time, like 5 to 15 or 20 years. And I understand 5 years is not that long, but in the cultural context of youth ministry, that's a pretty long time. But if you've been there for that duration, 5 years or more, and you haven't trained other people to do your job, and you leave, you're going to literally drop that church back half a decade or a decade, because everything that you did without training other people, they're going to revert back to what they used to do, or they're going to not do it as effectively, or they're going to drop that technology that you were using. And it can really, really put a damper and damage a lot on churches. And so training your volunteers, whether it be youth ministry or tech or worship or whatever, training your position to other people is really, really important. And I think so many times youth pastors miss that.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Again, the beauty of having several months is that I went into it knowing, and so I was able to make sure that everyone was as prepared as possible. But unfortunately, as Brent was talking, like I definitely did too much for a lot of different people, and so I knew that it was going to be a challenge for the church, because for the first time in a long time, they were going to have to start owning certain aspects. The mistake I made, um, and I think it's important for any type of pastor in any kind of ministry to understand this, is that sometimes we need to allow certain things to drop and certain things to fail. My fatal flaw is that when I see a problem, I feel a problem. Um, Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when you are already holding 5 plates and you add two more, one more even, can be the thing that makes the whole thing crumble. And it's an interesting thing to think about. But I mean, if you're a waiter and you have 5 different meals and extra drinks on your plate, you cannot put anything else on, or you literally run the risk of dropping everything and ruining the meal for everyone. Now everyone has to wait; they have to recook and everything else like that. And so the wheels literally fall off. And that was my biggest issue, is when I see something, I can't just sit back, and I think we have to be really careful not to over spiritualize. That was my biggest problem, is, well, God gave me these gifts for a reason. God gave me the ability to help people, and empathy and compassion. I can't just sit back. Like, that's just not in my DNA. And that can be a good thing, but it can also become really, really negative, because I sort of un, unknowingly, unintentionally built a bit of a savior complex in a sense. And I think we have to be really careful as pastors. We want to help people inherently. We want to do all the things. We want to use our gifts and our passions because, hey, this church believes in me. This community believes in me, and I can't sit back and let things just fall apart. But I needed to let a few things fall apart. And so when it came time to leave, several things did fall apart. And I've lived with this sort of guilt, if you will, over the last year, especially as I get phone calls and I see messages and I get emails and I get different things like, hey, things are falling apart. We need you to fix this. And then I have to say the thing I should have said years ago. I can't. And that has been the hardest challenge in all of this. And so I not only left the church in kind of a tough spot. I did train a lot of volunteers. It could have been a lot worse, but it could have been a lot better too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I-
I think that definitely, and I mean it's a pride complex is a huge deal. And I think pride is something that a lot of people in ministry struggle with. Just this mindset of like, oh, I can do it, so I must, or like it's my project now, or I mean, whatever. You kind of hit those and you feel them, and it's one of those things that a lot of times we can do it blindly, where we don't even notice it. And like that's the value of having those people that you're training regularly and teaching them how to do things. Because if you're not, then ultimately you're leading into a situation to where you run into that, like David said, that savior complex, where it's like you and no one else can do it. And it's like that's really not the case. I mean, you could train someone in an hour of what that job was, and they'd do it just as good as you. But like the question is, did you want to train someone else? Um, and so very important with that. Yeah, pride can be a very dangerous thing, especially with the savior complex.
yes. I would say also with transitions, the power of information. So especially if you've been there a while, you probably know the secrets of the church, where the things are, what happened to this cabinet over there, 12 years ago, something like that. And so usually in the world that we live in, information is power, that whole thing. And so it's okay to tell those things so you don't get called back to the church. Or where is the um, volleyball poles? Well, they're out back. And then the one I actually had to physically go to the church is, where is the sprinkler system in the playground? That one I had to take a pole and go through the dirt to find the plastic container that it was contained in. But I knew the general location, but they would never have been able to find it. So those are the things that you need to pass on, like those little pieces of information. What is in this closet? Where is the VBS supplies from 3 years ago? Even if you feel like I just need to write these things down in a document, and then that can be passed on. Because all of these things that we've been talking about would be the same thing if all of a sudden you are incapacitated. For example, you get in a car accident and you're in the hospital for 2 weeks. If other people don't know these things, if other people don't know how you do the things or where the things are, you're setting them up for failure for however long that you cannot come to church. So, similar if you were going on vacation, if you were having a baby, if your parent is sick and you need to go to the hospital for a while, it's keeping those secrets. Did you know there's a tunnel underneath the church in Harry United Methodist that where the sound equipment all runs? I know that. But like all of that information that you can share with other people, and so that things can still be running. So I think that would be the same if you were leaving the church or if something just happened to you. Okay,
Well, and
this one.
the other aspect to that is, for the love, write down every username and password you have to every
Yeah.
program or software or computer or ministry thing, social media account,
Mhm.
MailChimp. Write them all down.
And how to turn
Have
the
them
lights on.
accessible by other people.
Like
Huh?
how to turn the lights on. Like,
Yes. Like all of that stuff. If you have like, for instance, we have LED lights that are controlled by Bluetooth on our phone, like on my phone. Like, I need to work on having the ability to access that in a different route, because if my phone is off or if my phone doesn't work, then someone's going to have to reprogram every single one of those Bluetooth lights to get them to work. And so, like, stuff like that, it's
mhm.
stuff that needs to be
Yeah.
worked on. It's stuff that needs to be like thought of and recorded. And if you're like, man, I don't even know where to start, I would just say record a week of what you do. Every time you open an app, be like, oh yeah, that password.
Yep.
Or MailChimp. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, the social media. Yeah, this one, this one, this one. Website, this one. I mean, all the things that you do.
Yeah, and I'll say the other thing too that can help you in the writing process, because sometimes that can be a little daunting. You know, thinking about leaving where I was, I wrote everything down, but I also made videos for everything, every ministry, and stuff like that. Because sometimes reading, there's some things that could get lost
Mhm.
in translation. So I wanted to demonstrate, like, step one, you do this and you have a visual that you can go back to and look at. That really really helped. But coming here, I because I had just done that and thinking through that, I was like, I need to start right. And
Ooh.
so I did the exact same thing here, and went through and figured out what all the passwords were, which that was a challenge because things were written down, but they were too far
Passwords
back,
ago.
and
Yeah.
so all the passwords were completely wrong, and websites were wrong, and a lot of things were messed up. It took me a good 6 months to figure out all of the website stuff, all the email stuff, everything. We ended up switching our, we had a .church. We ended up having to go to a .com. I mean, it was a nightmare coming here. And so I had to kind of untangle a lot of webs when I got here, but I was taking videos. I will say pro tip for Brent, because I have the same lighting system, which, shout out to Brent. I have it because of him. I went to his youth room and was like, "That's cool. I want," and so he sent me a link. But what I did, so I have the same Bluetooth program to my phone, but I also have it programmed to the church iPad,
Oh,
as well as the pastor's phone and a youth volunteer's phone. So we have four different, exact same program all the way across. That if I can't be here because I'm sick or I'm out at camp, that's really what I was thinking. Is I'm out at camp several weeks of the year, especially the summer, and I just didn't want someone to be in trouble here. And so
hmm.
it's on the. So I know you have several church iPads, Brent. I'd put it on like two of them, and then you don't have to worry about it.
We've got the LEDs, but I have the remote control. So that just sits on the. You know how our soundboards? I have a Behringer X32 fancy thing, but it has that place where you can put your phone. Like that's where the remote lives. It goes right there
There you go.
on that
That's
little
smart. That's
grippy
smart.
pad, which is right next to where you like
Easy for people
hit
to
the
see
thing.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it is also neat that my kids know where all these things are. So we were having a Girl Scout Corps Awards in my youth building, and I was up there doing the presentations, and I went, "Oh man, I should have turned the stage lights on." And all of a sudden, they turned on, and my daughter is in the back going, "What? I turned them on for you!" So it's neat when your youth also know where these things are. Well, and I will say, when I got to this church, there's still things that I can't find or don't know why or what is this for. So, and I know that the youth pastors, the last three, I know them. And so one came for a funeral, and I swear I grabbed his hand and was like, "Yeah, you're coming with me," and dragged him over to the youth building to be like, what, when, what, why? And so he was like, okay, that. So that's super helpful too. Okay, so let's get back to transitioning. So tell me, how did you? So Brent, you said you had a really good program going, and so I'm guessing that meant lots of kids and lots of families. So how did you process your own emotions? Was there grief? Was there guilt? Was there excitement? Was there relief? Sounds like for David, during the transition, without projecting them onto your students. How do you not bring them into? If you're really sad, how do you not bring them into that and make them feel that as well? Or relief. That one could be bad too.
Well, not that y'all know this at all, but I've never been great at like showing or processing emotions. And so with that, like what I was sad about leaving, like I definitely was one of those things, like it was one of those that like it was a sad thing to announce to my leaders and announce to the students that I was leaving. But as far as that goes, like I don't think I necessarily transpired it upon them or like brought it upon them for them to kind of carry the weight of that. I think if anything, I probably rushed it too fast. I was like, oh hey, by the way, like announcement before we start, like I like in 2 months I'm leaving or whatever month I'm leaving. My last event will be this. All right, let's get into worship, kind of thing like that. Like not necessarily that fast, but I mean it was something that I probably should have spent a little bit more time on. And I do have one, like I had a kid tell me one thing on the day that I told them, and like it'll stick with me for the rest of my life because like, and I think that was one of the growing and learning moments in my ministry is I had told everybody and I overheard him say, "Man, this is the worst birthday ever." And so I didn't know it was his birthday. Yeah. And so, but that comment caught me off guard because it was just like, oh shoot. And I think part of it was due to the nature of, I think a lot of times we like David said earlier, we build ourselves into this kind of like savior complex where like things can't get done without us, or like, and it doesn't even necessarily have to sound that prideful. Like we're the ones that are going into the schools, we're the ones that are making the relationships, we're the ones that are doing all these different things, especially if you're the only youth pastor. And so, like, if you're the only youth pastor in a ministry and you are doing all of these things, the kids build bonds. Like, it happens. Like, that's the goal of youth ministry, is to build relationships so they, like, hopefully trust you enough to believe in Jesus. Like, ultimate goal of youth ministry. But at the same time, like, I think it's one of those things that, like, you see leaving and they see leaving in different lights. You see leaving as on to this new adventure. They see leaving as like, this is the best adventure I've had. And it's gone. And so especially with some families that have dealt with leaving in different scenarios and different contexts, that can definitely be harder and a much more difficult situation to deal with. But yeah, it was one of those comments that it was just like, oh, like, ouch, that really hurt. But it did allow me to slow down and catch the mindset of like, maybe there needs to be more intentionality and seriousness with this. And like I said, I told y'all before I even responded to this question, like picking up on emotional cues and stuff like that has not been a strong suit of mine. I've worked on it over the years. But it was definitely one of those things where like, I was just like, hey, all right, like like this needs to be said, just so y'all know. I did tell my leaders before youth started, so they had a little time to prepare. But yeah, it was just one of those things that like I think if anything, I probably rushed it a little too fast, and didn't allow time for them to cope. But I also noticed that night, and I was much more intentional about answering questions and being with students for the remainder of the time that I was there. And so much so that like I moved, ironically, I moved on December 25th, Christmas Day of 2016, because my wife had to start work on January 1st of 2017. And so we moved on Christmas Day because my in-laws came down for Christmas, and we were like, "Hey, do you want to help us move?" And so like they loaded up their cars and they drove back with us. Um, but with this, like we left on the 25th. I drove back, which it's a 5-hour drive. I drove back to my last church on December 28th to do my last event, because I said I would be there for that event. And so even though we had already moved, I drove all the way back to where I was, did a youth event, and then drove all the way home. And so it was one thing that like I noticed the intention that needed to be there, and it might have, like I said, might have been too fast at the beginning, but like really, really understand the mindset of like, especially for these kids that don't know the mindset of a youth pastor transition period of like typical youth pastor is 3-4 years and that's it. If I mean, it might be a little less than that in previous years. Let's be honest, but like they don't understand the turnaround, especially junior high kids. They're like, oh, well, you're the pastor's been here for 15 years. Why are you only here for 2? Like, kind of thing. And so it's one of those things that it's a new thing for them. And with new things come a lot of um, hurt and a lot of expectations that aren't met. So,
Yeah, so I think sort of the strategy here is take the time to. I think this is why that pastor conversation is so important. Is after we had the hard conversation, we were able to sort of transition into what is going to be our strategy in telling. And so, obviously, as Brent said, you're going to tell your leaders first, make sure they're prepared, and then you're going to tell your students. And so we were intentional about how soon do we tell the students, because here's the thing: as much as you can leave too fast, you can also not leave fast enough, if that makes sense. There is a point where the hurt is there and you want to say your goodbyes, but you know if you're there for, I'd say, and this is just a guesstimate. I mean, it depends on the culture that you're at, but 3 months may be too long. I felt that we told a little bit too soon, but I was following the direction of the pastor. I owed him that. I felt because I was the one leaving and he was the one who was going to be there, and so he kind of wanted to rip the band-aid right away, and I understand that and I backed it. I felt like, yeah, 2 months is probably the sweet spot. Just going off of my experience there, it gave me plenty of time to. I was already, so by the point that we had told them, I was already well in the process of handing the keys over. They just didn't necessarily realize it, and it helped that I already had a culture of every ministry had several volunteers that knew every aspect of everything I did. I had created that culture years before, and so it was easy in that sense. Um, but yeah, I think it is important to be intentional with your senior pastor, and with your leadership team at your church, to consider what the strategy is for how you tell people and how much time you give everybody, because you don't want it to be too quick, but you also don't want it to be too long either.
Yeah, that lingering feeling too. And especially, well, Brent, you said you went back for that one time, but if you decide you're going to leave a position and this is your last day, like coming back multiple times afterwards, not the best idea. We need to give
yeah.
people space to be able to process that and to move on.
Yeah.
So I think ChatGPT is figuring out that I also do Girl Scouts because its question says, "What does leaving a place better than you found it look like in practically in youth ministry?" Which is a Girl Scout phrase. But when you're thinking about that, how do you, in that same kind of context of leaving a place better than you found it, how do you empower your volunteers? How do you give them those the skills and the tools and the information that they need before you go?
I think with that, like, the big thing with volunteers is, I mean, volunteers are going to feel like they can't do it until they do. And so, like, not only training is huge, but allowing them to actually do it is vital. If you can step out of that scenario and allow them to step in and start doing it for you, then it's no longer, oh, I can't do this. It's oh, I've done that. That's not a big deal. And so having those moments and on those opportunities to where you can jump in and like teach them, but also kind of guide them through their first couple endeavors. And that might be something as trivial as running the soundboard, or that might be taking attendance, or that might be looking at the curriculum and figuring out how you lay out the curriculum and where do you do your small group questions and stuff like that, and knowing the ins and outs of like when you set up and all those different things. Like inviting them into that workspace is very, very important. And providing them with as much confidence as they can actually get doing those things is huge. I had a little bit of that. I was definitely before I left, I had realized, and I say before I left, I'd say within like the last year of that ministry, I had realized the need for consistency and need of that culture where volunteers knew what they were doing too. And so I had started allowing a lot more of that to happen. And I think it still wasn't quite enough. They did it for a while, and we'll go into this conversation much more next week. But like, you got to understand that the interim transition period for most churches is like 6 months to 18 months, depending on the church. Like most churches go a long time in between youth pastors because they're looking for the right person. And let's be honest, there's a lot of other things going on in the church, and they have this one committee that only meets once a month. And like, they're the ones that are in charge of hiring. And I mean, all these things, like there's tons of different things that come into play with that. But I do think with this, I tried to prepare them for as much as I could. And I literally handed them a 3-ring binder that had 6 months of lessons and curriculums planned. I told them where we go for mission trip, because at that time we did something called Army, where you just kind of sign up for it, and then they kind of tell you where you go. They tell you all the information you need. You just pay them, and they kind of run it. But then I told them how to register for church camps. I told them how to do everything, and I left in December. And so with that, I had planned them all the way out through summer. And was like, hey, none of this is registered yet, but you need to go here. You need to pay for this many people, start registrations, start signups at this date, kind of all these different things. And just kind of did as much prep work as I could to take that off of them before I left. And it worked well until that booklet stopped. As soon as they ran out of things that were telling them what to do, they stopped. Which was a really, really bad thing, because they didn't have a youth pastor for a year. And so the next like 5 months, they were flying by the seat of their pants. They were getting burned out. And they were questioning why they were doing this. And in all reality, at least in my opinion, the church got tired of the volunteers that were running it started getting a little louder, saying, hey, we're not going to do this forever. And the church just hired the next guy that applied. And they didn't find the right one. And so he was there for a year and a half, and then it went back into this same cycle. And so it's something that really has to be kind of across the board. Your church has to have the same vision and mindset when that comes. And I think David said that really, really well, with him, his pastor, and him being on the same board, like same mission. And like, we need to make this work. We need to work on like prioritizing how we leave. We need to prioritize how we make this run after you're gone. All these different things, like it needs to be a church effort.
Yeah, and I think one thing that also helped my former church is um, because of the way that I left, they had a guy hired before I left, um, and it gave them ample time, and so I reached out partially because the pastor asked me to, but also because I just wanted to. I care about the church that I left. It wasn't a situation where I left. I mean, yes, there were some things like any relationship, but I wanted to see that church continue to succeed and to ultimately thrive. And so I reached out to him personally, and I told him about our church. I told him the good, the bad, the ugly. I think that's important. Unfortunately, when churches are hiring, they're really like anything. They're good at selling all the good things, and really not so good at talking about the things that aren't great. And a lot of times, where we talk about why youth pastors leave so quickly, it's because a lot of times they're not told the truth. And I don't say that. No, no, I'm gonna be blunt because I think it's important. I think we need to be a little bit more critical of ourselves. I think we need to be honest with who we're hiring, and if that means that it detracts two or three people away from your ministry, then that's probably a good thing. Because as Brent said, they hired the first person. That person may not have been right for them, and they may not have been right for that person. And I think it's important to be really, really honest about what's going well, celebrate the good things, but also be honest about what's not going great. And I had, 10 years of personal experience as well as, understanding the history of the church. I knew all the youth pastors that left or, that were before me. I was really good friends with one of them. And so it's one of those things where I was able to tell him the truth, so to speak. And I was like, man, if that's something that you can get past, then I think this would be a great place for you. And so because of that honesty, we built a friendship, and it was to a point where, you know, kind of counter to what Melissa had said earlier, I did go back for several things, but part of that was I was committed before I left. And so I wanted to honor all my commitments. I think that's important. But it's one of those things where, again, being in the Methodist Church, there's a lot of connectivity there. And, so we've done several things. So that's been kind of I guess a beautiful part of it is we've continued to be friends through it. And so I guess I've really appreciated that we've had that opportunity. But I think, again, it's really, really important to be honest. And when you do so, it gives the next person the opportunity to sort of mentally, emotionally, spiritually prepare for what they're walking into. And yeah, so I've been able to really, really help with some of those things. And then, once you got there, it's like, just because, you have all these videos and you have all these books doesn't necessarily mean that that person's going to understand. And so, I was lucky enough that I'm an hour away. And so, there were several times where I would get a phone call from the next, or, the current youth pastor that's there. And he was like, hey, I'm sorry to ask this. I'll buy you lunch, but hey, do you mind coming back and, walking through some of this stuff with me? And I was like, man, I'd love to, And so just being open to helping them succeed, and now they're at a place where, they have been able to effectively transition to the way that he does it. And it's been a really cool thing. And so, if you have the opportunity and you have that relationship to be able to go and help when invited to do so, obviously talk to your family and talk to your current church and make sure they're cool with that, which I did. But yeah, there can still be some positive even in your transition out.
So, big last question. So, we've talked a lot about our personal experiences. And so, just I want to see if you have seen it out in the world examples of churches or youth ministries where the transition was done like really well. Like, you're like, that's, if I do this again, that's what I want to do. And so I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I will say one of the things that when I started here, they did have that volunteer in the fill-in thing. And one of the things that I appreciated with her is that she sat down with me, and it wasn't about the procedures or the where things were. I had to find all those things, but she sat down with me and had folders. She's an admin person. She had folders for each student, and she went and through and told me exactly who they were and the struggles they had in their life and like who they live with and all that personal information that, sometimes takes a bit to get to know kids, but some of these things you do need to know right off the bat, like especially if it's, um, mom's in prison right now and dad is the pickup person, like we need to know those kinds of things. um, and so I really appreciated that because it was more of, and this was the pastor's wife, she was not concerned about how I was going to do the job, she was concerned about the kids. And so I really
That's
appreciated that.
important.
Have y'all seen other versions
Yeah.
of that?
Yeah, I did that for all of our students and all of our volunteers. But one thing that I put a caveat on it, because one thing that I wished I would have gone back and done differently is that the youth pastor before me, who I was friends with, at my former church, he did a folder on all of the students and leaders, and I made the mistake of reading it before I formed my own opinions. And what I mean by that is I went into it with the old youth pastor's biases. And some of those biases, in my opinion, were dead wrong. Some of the things that he said negatively about certain students, he just, as nicely as I could put it, he had his favorites. And he certainly had, and all of us do, let's be honest, sometimes we just gel with certain students. But if they weren't in his sort of cool club, then they were discarded. And there were certain students that I tried really, really hard not to see them that way in the beginning. But and thankfully I saw very quickly that he was wrong. But at the same time, it could have done damage if I would have just blindly followed what he said. And so what I encouraged what I encouraged, I'll just say the name because he's been on the podcast. I encouraged Vernon to get to know some people, form his own opinions, and then read it. Because I didn't want him going into any of those relationships with certain biases. And then at that point, it's like a comparison. Like, hey, do we see this student, this leader? Do we see the value in them in the same way? Am I perceiving that person correctly or properly? And it was really cool. We got lunch a few months later, and he had finally read through those. He was like, "Man, you nailed it." He was like, "Man, I really appreciate that you gave me the freedom to kind of get to know them and form my own relationships." And he was like, "Man, I totally agree with you." And we were able to kind of, it ended up being a really fun and good conversation, kind of reminiscing some of those things. But I don't know that that's the best way to do it, but I think it certainly worked, for Vernon, and it was certainly a detriment to me in that particular situation. I think that's different than what you described, because she took the time to actually,
you could almost have two lists, like you would have like the read before and then read 3 reads later.
Because some things are just honest. Like you have this set of volunteers that are going to be there no matter what. They've been here for years. Mm-hmm. They love these students. The students are bought into them. They are bought into the students. Like those kind of lists. Yeah, that was the kind of thing that I said, hey, this is who you have.
Yeah. Well,
this is who you can work with. Like, this is their strengths and gifts.
Yeah, I've got one student who had a heart problem and he's not allowed to play certain games. Like, and then
those things they have to know that.
Yeah, these are things
they have to know the health things. Yeah. They need to know the emergency
first,
things.
And then in 3 weeks, read my opinions.
Absolutely.
That'd be like a treasure hunt almost. Okay, Brent, what do you've got to say for the last thing?
I would say as far as transitions, my both of my transition story is probably the best transition I've ever had and the worst transition I've ever had. Both happened in the church that I'm in currently, but it was me more in an administrative leadership role, and it involved two of my four associate youth pastors. And And so my best transition probably that I've ever experienced in ministry was the last transition that I did, from my last associate to my current associate, because it was almost a seamless transition. Like no problems, no nothing. The students bought in, the students moved on. It was perfect. She stayed around because she didn't leave town. She stayed around as a volunteer. But like literally, Shauna, who's my assistant now, or associate, I hate the word assistant, associate youth pastor now. She was a volunteer. And so, and her best friend basically was my associate youth pastor, and she said she was going to have to step down. And so they literally just went whoop and flipped. And so my volunteer became my associate youth pastor, and my associate youth pastor became my volunteer. And it was the smoothest, most seamless transition I think I've ever experienced in my entire life. Worked out incredibly well. First associate youth pastor that I had here did not go well, and he ended up getting fired because he also applied for the main youth pastor job, and I beat him out as far as a qualifications standpoint. And so with that being said, he my pastor graciously was like, look, like, we'd love to keep you on staff, but like, we're going to go another direction. Here's why. And it was immediately divisiveness and splitting off, and him trying to make the youth group not like me, and like all kinds of just crazy bonkers stuff. And basically, like one Wednesday that I was here, I was just, I was brand new trying to step in, and he was like, you just need to follow me, okay? Because I know what I'm doing. And I was like, and so of course, that was not the only thing they heard. Parents began to call and say that their kid was telling them to meet this youth pastor outside of church to do their own youth group, and like all kinds of crazy stuff. And so parents started calling and being concerned, and so my pastor had to step in and ended up asking him to step down because of just not handling it well. So I have seen all of the ins and outs, the goods, the bads, the uglies. I'm really grateful that the good is now and the bad was right when I started. But yeah, it was definitely an interesting scenario to deal with. But yeah, so not necessarily my transitions, but I've dealt with transitions that were, one was perfect, like could not have gone better, and then the other one was as far away from perfect as humanly possible.
That makes sense. Well, as Brent said, we're going to be talking about this culture of consistency and things along these lines for the rest of the month. So be sure to check us out. If you are interested in talking about a certain topic, or if you want to come and tell us what you're doing, just leave us a message on all of our socials, and check out our blog at studentministryconversations.org. And I think that's it for today. Gentlemen, do you have anything else to say?
No, I think it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks for this conversation. This conversation was great. So
Awesome. Okay, y'all have a great day. We'll see you later.